What makes a good opening? Maybe a question to hook your audience, or perhaps an anecdote that sets the stage for what you're going to discuss. You know, something like,
The year is 2019. I'm in middle school, freaking out about getting the new Smash Bros. Game, while in New York City, they just greenlit a TV adaptation of the novel Station 11.
a few weeks back, the YouTube algorithm recommended me a video called Nightmare Eyes, a Night in the Woods character analysis by the essayist Writing Woman. While there's no shortage of Night in the Woods analysis on YouTube, her video stuck with me more than most others I've watched, due, in part, to her opening. She opens with the main menu of Night in the Woods, almost looking like a playthrough of the game. It's only once she loads into the first area that she starts speaking. It's subtle, but she's able to contextualize her thesis by blending the intro of her essay's subject with the intro of her essay itself. It's a great video, and it got me thinking about the intro to Night in the Woods. The game opens on a poem, and in doing so employs a similar blending strategy that Writing Woman's video had. Though instead of blending thesis and subject, it instead blends the identities it holds as both a video game and as a work of literature. So I was surprised to find that no one had made a video on it. And real quick here, I want to offer a mild spoiler warning. While you don't have to have played Night in the Woods to appreciate this essay, it will likely make a little more sense if you had. The game opens on a poem, and though I won't be going into any major story elements after it, I will be walking through said poem in its entirety. Now, opening an essay is one thing, but opening a narrative is another. This essay aims to understand why Night in the Woods has such an effective intro, ideally extrapolating strategies to help both me and you become better narrative artists. So without further ado, let's begin this video with the first thing you encounter in Night in the Woods. The opening poem functions as something of a choose-your-own-adventure book, with the player occasionally being offered a list of possible stanzas to choose from. The first time in the poem you have this choice, you get 2. The second time, you get 3, and the third and final option gives you 4, totaling to 24 different possible versions of the poem. It opens with, "In the year Granddad died," which you can then follow up with either, "The highway extension came," or "We had the worst flood since 1998. Choosing the flood route, it reads, "Greg got trapped on top of a doghouse. The power was out for 2 days. Casey Hartley came by on his dad's boat, and I laughed when I saw him." Alternatively, the highway extension route reveals that the road through Possum Springs had been the only way to get to the state park. The highway took the traffic, but gave us Donut Wolf. These two choices, though different, communicate the same thing to the player, that Night in the Woods doesn't have typical exposition. In a more standard text opening, think Star Wars, the writing isn't used as a way to portray character, but a way to portray setting. Typically, the strategy is employed in high fantasy settings that wouldn't have a better way to explain parts of their world to the audience. And while on a certain level this does similar things by mentioning important characters like Greg or places like Donut Wolf, the primary element being shown here is May's perspective on what matters about these events. To her, the flood is tied more to Casey's boat and Greg's doghouse predicament more than the damage it caused the town. Similarly, the highway extension route ends on May sugarcoating her issues at the state of things. She doesn't claim to be outraged at the construction dooming her home to an unstable economy, but just lightly sardonic at the idea of trading financial success for what's essentially a Krispy Kreme. In a similar display of character, May abruptly switches topics at the beginning of her next stanza, something all too common in her dialogue. It reads, "Granddad left me an apple crate of books. He loved ghost stories and quoted them to himself in the hospital bed." After this, the player has 3 options of which ghost story quote to choose, only seeing the first half of each. You can either choose, "They feared death," "In their wings, in the trees," or "They went looking for the gods." The full lines turn out as, "They feared death, so they ate the young. In their wings, in the trees, all things die, be at peace. And they went looking for the gods, and died in lonely places." Each of these quotes establish the core theme and feeling of powerlessness at the heart of Night in the Woods. Upon reflection, the 2 possible anecdotes of the first stanza function as day-to-day examples of this feeling, either powerless to an uncaring economy or an uncaring climate. However, when May moves from sharing her own memories to sharing the quotes of her grandfather's books, the apathetic attitude the game has presented thus far shifts to something much more overtly existential. In this way, the feeling of powerlessness has left the realm of tangible disenfranchisement and entered the realm of existential dread. This juggling of tone and subject matter is reflective of the overall story structure in Night in the Woods. Days are spent chatting with folks around town and hanging with May's friends, specifically Greg or B. While these hangouts are often as uneventful as accompanying B to work or getting donuts with Greg, the conversations you have during them are similarly thought-provoking to the ghost story quotes shared in the poem. Take one of the examples I just mentioned. When Greg and you get donuts together, he shares the story of how he accidentally let out some sheep on a relative's farm, with all of them running into oncoming traffic. He tells May, "I failed those sheep. Just like, everything has failed us. No one even denies it. No one tries to talk you out of leaving here." While less flowery in their use of language, Greg's words certainly strike an emotional chord in the same manner as the ghost story quotes, though still grounded in the day-to-day experiences of living in the Rust Belt, like the anecdotes that May shares. Following this section, the poem continues to blend the existential with the day-to-day in its final stanzas. It opens with, "On the last day, he sat up suddenly and stared bug-eyed through the window." The player options this time dictate exactly what it is that Granddad looks at from his hospital bed. Either at the old playground, the old trains, the old empty mill, or the old parking lots. This final player-dictated stanza has significantly more cohesion when compared to the other two, each of the possible lines starting with "at the old." This further establishes the setting of Night in the Woods, that being a worn-down Rust Belt town suffering from a harsh climate and harsher economy, with all the relics of what could have been blending together into a gray muck of loss. Critically, however, each is followed up with a description of different ways to respond to that feeling. The old trains rattling from somewhere else to somewhere else, envious of places free from this feeling. The old playground half washed away, and the old empty mill, windows half busted out, nostalgic for a time free of this feeling. And finally, the old parking lots, wide and sparkling like oceans, hopeful to overcome this feeling. The final stanza, regardless of player choice, reads, "He turned to my dad, eyes still wide. 'This house is haunted,' he said, and died." This both functions as a conclusion to the poem and as an example of gameplay. There's a 3-step formula to most games, known as context, choice, consequence. Night in the Woods breaks this formula by having consequences almost entirely predetermined regardless of player choice. So while I empathize with players that find this irritating, I think it works to boost the core theme of powerlessness by legitimizing it in gameplay. This is precisely why Night in the Woods is often referred to as a walking simulator. Aside from brief minigames, the game is entirely walking from place to place and talking to people. And in terms of affecting the world, the player isn't rewarded for doing any of it. In this way, the poem functions as something of a litmus test, in which a player that finds this lack of consequential choice, coupled with the copious text, irritating, is incentivized to not go any further, as they wouldn't enjoy the rest of the game. While writing about my interpretation of the poem and its strengths, I wanted to go back to writing women's videos on Night in the Woods, due to them kickstarting my inspiration to make this essay. Sadly, she didn't speak about her opinions on the poem at length in any of her videos. So I reached out, seeing if she'd be open to discussing it with me, and lucky for me, she agreed to do a Zoom interview. While asking her about the opening poem, she shared,
"But that intro, I think, is one of the best crafted intros to any game. So good. This house is haunted gets me every time. This house is haunted can mean a lot of things. Not just their house, but their home, as in this town, this state, this country, this place. This place is haunted. And all of the various examples, the parking lots, the shiny new paved parking lots are paving over the bones of this old world, this old prosperity that we see this town has lost and desperately trying to bring it back. It's haunted by the idea of what was and what could have been. Remembering back to my first experience playing it, this house is haunted. I sat there and I kind of looked at it for a little while, and then I went and replayed the intro, and I tried to go through all of the different options to see if that part changed.
I want to focus on what she shared about the idea of being haunted by what was and what could have been. When re-examining the poem through this lens, the cohesion becomes instantly more apparent. The opening line reveals May's preoccupation with what was in her grandfather's death, reflecting not on missed opportunities, on what could have been, but rather fond memories of, again, what was. Immediately after, we get the ghost story quotes from May's grandfather, revealing his own preoccupation with what could have been. He reflects on his own life, with each of these quotes mentioning death and what to do with its presence. Finally, we get Grandpa's final sight, a blending of the two. He looks at what is. The old trains, the old playground, the old empty mill, the old parking lots. As he does, his eyes are described as bug-like, as in more than human. After this gaze, he turns to his family, eyes still wide. This house is haunted, he said, and died. I agree with Writing Woman in her take that Night in the Woods has one of the best crafted intros to any game. And beyond working as an amazing opener to the game itself, it can teach us universal strategies to open our own narratives. I think there are 3 main takeaways I have from the poem: how it handles exposition, how it presents the main experiences you have in the game, and ultimately presents itself honestly and filters out any players who wouldn't enjoy Night in the Woods. Starting with the piece on exposition, I've created a handy acronym for how Night in the Woods decides to show its world: Incomplete Character Exposition, or ICE for short. May's loose grip on reality becomes significantly more overt as the game progresses, but even focusing on the opening alone still reveals an incomplete perspective on the town of Possum Springs. Right after the poem, May is in a train station, and the player has the option of getting her opinion on a poster advertising the town. She claims Possum Springs has never looked more falsely advertised. All we know about Possum Springs thus far is that May dislikes it, it flooded, and it was once home to more businesses based on its route to the state park, which has since been taken by the highway. And while none of these observations are inaccurate, they are certainly incomplete. She fails to mention things like the lack of youth in Possum Springs, the generally conservative populations, the dense downtown, the old trolley station, or the abandoned grocery store. Instead, the player gets to experience these things alongside May, having the world feel as though it's expanding as the player explores it further, rather than it feeling expansive from the jump the way it does in something like Breath of the Wild. And to be clear, that is a great game, but it's trying to communicate something different than Night in the Woods in its gameplay. Night in the Woods knows what it is and what it wants to express, and designs the exposition of its world around that. So in terms of a specific lesson, once you understand what your narrative expresses, decide whether it makes more sense to reveal more of the world itself or a character's perspective on the world. On the topic of gameplay, I've already mentioned how Night in the Woods demonstrates its core gameplay loop in the poem. But in terms of your work, the larger skill on display here is blending different experiences your art will provide your audience. And this part is more universal than world building. Take this essay, for example. The narrative component is minimal, but the strategy still applies. I wanted to do 2 main things with this: explore Night in the Woods' opening, and create a mini strategy guide on creating your own. I attempted to blend the 2 in my opening by briefly analyzing a different essay, as well as mentioning strategies used to open essays more generally in the first few lines I share. By understanding what experiences you want to bring your audience, having each of them present in your opening provides a more holistic glimpse into the rest of your work. And finally, be honest in your opening. Don't try to present your work as something it's not. As I mentioned, the poem functions as something of a litmus test, having audiences who wouldn't enjoy the core experience being instantly turned away, by having said core experience on full display. Ideally, your introduction should function as something similar, a way to signify who this was made for and who it wasn't. Night in the Woods influences what and how I write in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I think it found me at a perfect time in which I was experiencing a distinct lack of inspiration in what I was consuming. While I'm not much of a fiction writer, my essays have undoubtedly been improved by the experience of playing and replaying this game. While I don't think it's for everyone, I can at least say with certainty that the strategies it employs, in both its intro and the entire game, have been wonderful lessons in writing for myself and countless others. I implore you to find what inspires you, to understand why that is, and to use those tools for your own creative endeavors. The world deserves your art, so go make some. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I just want to have a couple quick shoutouts, because this essay wouldn't be possible without a couple people.
Hey all, it's Editing Sam. So the footage for my outro got really messed up and weird, so I'm just going to read off what I have on my Google Doc rather than re-record and get my whole setup perfected again. First of all, I want to thank Writing Woman. I obviously mentioned a couple times now how her essay had inspired this, but she was also very helpful and quick to respond when I reached out about the Zoom interview. So big shout out to her. You should definitely go subscribe to her YouTube channel. She makes excellent content about Night in the Woods and a ton of other things. Right now she has a video series on Life is Strange that I couldn't recommend more. I also want to shout out the video essay Discord server I'm in, which offered a lot of really good advice, both in terms of the writing, but also the more YouTuber, content creator aspect of all this. And finally, I want to thank everyone who's watching right now. This has been so incredible to make over the last few months, and I'd like to do more of it in the future. Like I said in my last video, I'm very new to all of this, and any critiques of any kind would be really appreciated. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.